Hey guys, settle here. Tonight we began when medieval queens took revenge without lifting a weapon. But before we get started, make sure that you subscribed and comment me where are you watching from. Medieval revenge is usually imagined as loud swords, shouting, public executions, maybe a dramatic betrayal in a candlelit hall. That image exists because it's easy to remember. What people forget is that the medieval world also rewarded patience, silence, and the ability to wait longer than everyone else. This was especially true for women in power, who were rarely allowed the luxury of open violence. Queens were expected to smile, endure, and disappear quietly into marriage, motherhood, or history. Some of them did exactly that. Others took notes. These women did not take revenge by raising armies themselves or swinging weapons on battlefields. They took revenge by surviving, by remaining present, and by quietly positioning themselves so that when power shifted, and it always did, they were still standing while their enemies were not. This kind of revenge was not exciting in the moment. It was deeply inconvenient over time. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor did not begin her life as a woman waiting patiently in the background. She was wealthy, intelligent, and politically dangerous before most of her enemies realized that was a problem. Married first to the King of France and later to the King of England, Eleanor spent much of her adult life surrounded by men who believed they were in control of her. They were wrong, but it took decades for the consequences to arrive. Her marriage to Henry II of England was not a partnership. It was a collision. Eleanor had lands, influence, and opinions. Henry had authority, ambition, and very little tolerance for being challenged. Over time, he began to view Eleanor less as a queen and more as a complication. When their sons rebelled against him, Henry blamed Eleanor, which was convenient, because blaming her allowed him to solve multiple problems at once. His solution was imprisonment. Eleanor was confined for years, not in chains or darkness, but in a carefully managed captivity designed to erase her relevance. She was kept comfortable enough that no one could accuse Henry of cruelty, but restricted enough that she could not interfere. The assumption was simple. Time would dull her influence. Isolation would weaken her network. Eventually, she would fade. She did not fade. She watched. She remembered. And most importantly, she outlived Henry. When Henry died, Eleanor emerged from confinement with alarming efficiency. She did not need to announce her return. Everyone already knew. She immediately became the central figure holding together the reigns of her sons, first Richard and later John. She governed, negotiated, traveled, and commanded respect across Europe. The years Henry had spent trying to silence her were quietly undone by the fact that she was now indispensable. Her revenge was not a speech or a trial. It was legacy. Henry is remembered as a powerful but deeply flawed king, overshadowed by rebellion and family conflict. Eleanor is remembered as one of the most formidable political figures of the medieval world. She did not destroy him. She outlasted him, and then she controlled how history remembered them both. This pattern repeats more often than medieval chroniclers were comfortable admitting. Blanche of Castile understood this well. As Queen of France and later regent for her young son, Blanche ruled in a political environment that did not believe she should exist in power at all. Nobles resisted her authority constantly, often openly. They did not always insult her directly. That would have been risky. Instead, they undermined, delayed, and challenged her decisions, assuming that eventually she would be replaced by a man more suitable for the role. Blanche did not react emotionally. She did not seek dramatic confrontation. She governed. She made alliances carefully. She rewarded loyalty and remembered disobedience. She used legitimacy, law, and the simple fact that she was in charge long enough for opposition to become exhausting. Her revenge against those who doubted her was procedural. They were sidelined, isolated, or quietly removed from influence not through violence, but through irrelevance. By the time her son reached adulthood, Blanche had stabilized the kingdom and eliminated most of her opposition without ever appearing openly vengeful. Those who had mocked her authority lived long enough to realize that resisting her had achieved absolutely nothing. Then there was Isabella of France, who took a different approach entirely. Isabella's marriage to Edward II of England was not unhappy because of a single betrayal. It was unhappy because Edward consistently chose everyone else over her. His favorites dominated court politics, humiliated Isabella publicly, and made it clear that her role was decorative at best. Edward assumed she would endure this indefinitely. Queens were expected to. Isabella endured nothing. She observed. She catalogued resentment. She paid attention to who was insulted by Edward's behavior, who lost power because of his favorites, and who quietly wished for a different arrangement. When she traveled abroad under the excuse of diplomacy, she did not rush back. She returned with support. Not just soldiers, but legitimacy. When Isabella landed in England, the response was not resistance. It was relief. Edward was captured with astonishing speed. His reign collapsed not because of a dramatic battle, but because almost no one was willing to defend him. Isabella did not personally order executions. She did not need to. Edward was deposed and imprisoned. His death followed soon after under circumstances that remain suspicious but conveniently undocumented. Isabella's revenge was so clean that chroniclers struggled to describe it as revenge at all. They framed it as political necessity. This is often how effective revenge is recorded. As inevitability, Margaret of Anjou learned the limits of patience the hard way. As queen during the Wars of the Roses, Margaret was not allowed the luxury of subtlety forever. She was forced into open conflict eventually, but her earlier years were spent navigating a court that doubted her, resisted her, and underestimated her. She responded by building loyalty quietly, aligning herself with those who benefited from her survival, and refusing to retreat into passivity. Her revenge against those who dismissed her authority was persistence. Even after defeat, exile, and personal loss, Margaret remained a symbol of resistance long enough to destabilize her enemies repeatedly. She did not win in the end, but she ensured that victory cost her enemies far more than they expected. Not all medieval queens had access to armies or regencies. Some operated entirely within domestic and administrative spaces, where revenge looked even less dramatic. Take Matilda of Tuscany, who did not rule as a queen in name but wielded authority that rivaled kings and emperors. Matilda was repeatedly challenged by male rulers who assumed she would eventually surrender control of her lands. She did not argue. She governed. She built alliances with the papacy. She funded armies without commanding them. She survived political storms that destroyed far louder figures. Her revenge was longevity. Emperors who tried to break her power died, failed, or were forced to negotiate. Matilda remained. By the end of her life, even her enemies treated her authority as unavoidable. She had not defeated them in battle. She had exhausted them. This is the recurring theme. Medieval queens who took revenge without lifting weapons understood something deeply uncomfortable about power. Violence is immediate. Memory is permanent. Survival is humiliating to those who expected your absence. They did not rush. They did not forgive. They waited until revenge looked like governance, until victory looked like stability, and until their enemies could no longer complain without admitting failure. This kind of revenge rarely appears in heroic songs. It appears in administrative records, in succession lists, in the quiet fact that one name remains while another disappears. Medieval queens did not always need swords. They needed time. And time, inconveniently, was very often on their side. They also understood something else that rarely gets mentioned in heroic retellings. Power does not always need to announce itself to be effective. In fact, the more quietly it operates, the harder it is to resist. Medieval queens who survived long enough learned how to let others exhaust themselves first. They let men argue, rebel, demand, threaten, and posture, while they remained exactly where they were, watching the pattern repeat until opposition collapsed under its own weight. Consider Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I of England. Her revenge story is not a clean arc of victory. It is messier, slower, and arguably more instructive. Matilda was named her father's heir in a world that had no interest in accepting a woman as ruler. When Henry died, the nobles who had sworn loyalty to her immediately discovered excuses to forget those oaths. A cousin took the throne instead, supported by men who suddenly remembered tradition when it became useful. Matilda did not accept this quietly. But she also did not rush blindly into destruction. She fought when necessary, retreated when survival required it, and endured years of instability that would have broken less stubborn figures. Her revenge did not arrive in her lifetime. That was the point. She endured long enough to make her claim unavoidable. Her son, Henry II, eventually became king. The throne that had been denied to her passed directly through her persistence. This is one of the coldest forms of medieval revenge. You do not need to win personally. You only need to ensure that your enemy's victory does not last. Queens understood lineage better than most. They knew that power extended beyond individual lifetimes. When denied authority directly, they embedded themselves into succession, governance, and legitimacy so deeply that removing them became impossible without dismantling the entire system. Most systems were not willing to do that. Adelaide of Italy learned this lesson early. Widowed, imprisoned, and threatened with forced marriage by rivals who wanted her crown, Adelaide escaped confinement and appealed directly to Otto I of Germany. This was not romantic desperation. It was calculation. By aligning herself with Otto, Adelaide secured protection, status, and eventually the title of Empress. Her revenge against those who had imprisoned her was not violent. It was structural. She became untouchable. The men who had tried to erase her authority were sidelined permanently. They did not lose their lives. They lost relevance, which in medieval society was often worse. Revenge through elevation was one of the most effective strategies available to medieval women. You did not need to destroy your enemies. You only needed to rise high enough that they could no longer reach you. Others chose revenge through visibility. Queen Tamar of Georgia ruled in a world that expected her to fail. She did not. Tamar governed effectively, expanded territory, stabilized internal politics, and presided over a cultural flourishing that later generations remembered as a golden age. Her revenge against those who doubted her was success so undeniable that opposition became embarrassing. She did not need to punish her critics directly. History did it for her. Their doubts aged poorly. Tamar's reign did not erase resistance, but it made it irrelevant. The narrative moved on without them. Medieval queens also understood the value of selective silence. Sometimes revenge was not acting at all, but allowing enemies to overreach while you remained outwardly compliant. Anne of Kiev, Queen of France, mastered this. As a foreign queen in an unfamiliar court, Anne was expected to adapt, obey, and fade into ceremonial life. Instead, she quietly maintained influence over royal decisions, signed documents independently, and participated in governance in ways that unsettled those who preferred her silent. After her husband's death, Anne did not retreat. She remained active, remarried strategically, and continued to influence political affairs. Her revenge against those who expected her disappearance was persistence. She remained present long after her usefulness was assumed to be over. This pattern appears again and again. Medieval women in power were often underestimated not because they lacked ability, but because their methods did not resemble traditional displays of dominance. They did not always shout. They did not always march at the head of armies. They ruled through continuity. Sometimes revenge was as simple as refusing to be replaced. Berengaria of Navarre, wife of Richard the Lionheart, spent most of her marriage ignored. Richard preferred campaigns to companionship and left Berengaria isolated, underfunded, and politically vulnerable. After Richard's death, she was denied her rightful income and status by his successor. Berengaria responded not with rebellion, but with relentless legal pressure. She appealed to the Pope. She documented grievances. She waited. For years. Eventually, she secured recognition, resources, and autonomy. The men who had dismissed her claims were forced to comply publicly. Her revenge arrived in installments, paid through obligation rather than blood. Legal revenge was deeply uncomfortable for medieval rulers. It required acknowledgement. You could not simply silence it without admitting fault. Queens also took revenge through education. By shaping heirs, advisors, and courts, they ensured that future power reflected their values rather than their enemies' intentions. Agnes of Poitou ruled as regent for her young son during a volatile period of the Holy Roman Empire. Her authority was constantly challenged by nobles and clergy who resented female leadership. Agnes responded by cultivating reformist alliances and reinforcing her son's legitimacy. Even after losing formal power, her influence lingered in the structures she helped shape. Her revenge was not immediate. It unfolded across decades, embedded in decisions she never lived to see implemented. This is the unglamorous truth of medieval revenge without weapons. It required an extraordinary tolerance for delay. It demanded the ability to endure insult without response, humiliation without protest, and confinement without surrender. It was revenge for people who understood that history moves slowly, but remembers clearly. Sometimes revenge was not even intentional. Sometimes survival alone was enough. Queens who lived longer than expected disrupted plans built around their absence. Political arrangements assumed death, retirement, or obedience. When those assumptions failed, entire strategies collapsed. This was especially destabilizing in courts that relied on marriage as a tool of control. Women who outlived their political usefulness became anomalies. They did not fit the system anymore, and systems struggle with anomalies. Even religious life was not immune to this dynamic. Queens who entered convents did not always surrender power. Some transformed religious institutions into political hubs, maintaining correspondence, influence, and patronage networks that continued shaping events beyond the reach of secular rivals. Revenge did not always mean harm. Sometimes it meant refusing to conform to the ending others had written for you. Medieval chroniclers often minimized these stories. They framed female authority as temporary, accidental, or disruptive. They preferred narratives where women vanished quietly after fulfilling their roles. But records tell a different story. One of prolonged presence. The most unsettling thing about these queens was not their anger. It was their endurance. They did not burn cities. They did not massacre enemies. They did not need to. They forced their opponents to live with the consequences of underestimating them. And those consequences tended to last. Because medieval revenge without violence does not look like revenge at first. It looks like survival. It looks like administration. It looks like governance continuing uninterrupted while opposition fades into complaints, then silence. By the time history notices, it is already over. And that, perhaps, is why this kind of revenge was the most feared of all. It is also worth noticing how often this kind of revenge confused the people living through it. Contemporaries did not always recognize what was happening. They expected revenge to arrive as punishment, as spectacle, as blood. When it arrived instead as continuity, they struggled to name it. Chroniclers wrote about stability, order, or divine favor, because admitting that patience had defeated force was uncomfortable in a culture built on martial ideals. This confusion worked in the queen's favor. Revenge that goes unnoticed cannot be resisted. Take Urraca of Leon and Castile. Her reign was loud, chaotic, and openly contested, but the revenge embedded within it was quieter. Urraca inherited a kingdom that many believed she should not control alone. Her marriage was meant to correct that problem. Instead, it created another one. Her husband attempted to dominate her authority entirely, reducing her to a symbol while he ruled. Urraca refused. She endured civil war, rebellion, and near-constant resistance. She made mistakes, lost battles, and faced relentless criticism. But she did not step aside. Her revenge was not a single victory. It was the simple, stubborn fact that ruled until her death. Her son inherited a united kingdom because she refused to let it fracture permanently under male correction. The men who tried to replace her were remembered as disruptions. She was remembered as the ruler. This distinction mattered. Medieval queens understood that legitimacy was cumulative. Every year you remained in power made your presence harder to dispute. Every document signed, every court held, every decision enforced added weight to your authority. Revenge came not from one decisive moment, but from accumulation. Some queens used absence strategically as well. Stepping back temporarily could be a way to let enemies expose themselves. Joan of Navarre, accused of witchcraft and imprisoned by her own stepson, Henry V of England, did not panic. She was confined, stripped of income, and publicly humiliated. The charges were vague, dramatic, and deeply convenient. Joan waited. When Henry died unexpectedly, the accusations collapsed with him. Joan was released, restored, and compensated. Her revenge was not retaliation. It was vindication. The men who had accused her gained nothing. She regained everything. Vindication was a powerful form of revenge in a religious society. It implied divine correction. If you survived false accusations, your enemies looked not only cruel, but wrong. Sometimes revenge took the form of quiet correction rather than confrontation. Queens who were dismissed as emotional, weak, or irrational often responded by becoming the most reliable figures in unstable systems. Reliability itself became a rebuke. When chaos followed male ambition, female continuity looked increasingly attractive. This is how some queens gained influence even without formal authority. Regents, advisors, and dowagers often wielded more power than crowned kings during periods of instability. Their revenge against exclusion was indispensability. A system that relies on you cannot easily remove you. Margaret of Provence understood this deeply. As Queen of France, she was surrounded by male relatives who competed for influence. She responded by building her own network, managing correspondence, and maintaining alliances that extended beyond her husband's reign. When political tides shifted, Margaret remained relevant because she had made herself useful to everyone. Revenge did not always require resentment. Sometimes it required competence. Queens also understood the power of narrative. They did not always need to act directly. They needed to be remembered correctly. By funding religious institutions, commissioning chronicles, and patronizing scholars, medieval women shaped how their lives were recorded. Revenge could be as subtle as ensuring that future generations inherited a version of events where your enemies appeared short-sighted, cruel, or foolish. This was not vanity. It was insurance. History was not neutral. It could be influenced, edited, softened, or sharpened. Queens who understood this weaponized memory. Even apparent submission could be strategic. Some queens accepted temporary humiliation because they knew it would not last. They bowed publicly and ruled privately. This frustrated enemies who wanted resistance they could crush. Silence gave them nothing to fight. Silence, in these cases, was not surrender. It was refusal to play the expected role, and this is where medieval revenge without weapons becomes deeply unsettling. It denies the enemy satisfaction. There is no moment of triumph. No acknowledgement. Just the slow realization that control never fully arrived. Queens who practiced this kind of revenge often became problems that could not be solved, only endured. They were still there. Still signing documents. Still advising kings. Still shaping alliances. Still present. Time did not remove them. Time empowered them. This forced a psychological shift in medieval politics. Men accustomed to quick resolutions struggled with opponents who would not escalate, retreat, or disappear. They aged. They died. The queen remained. Revenge, in this context, was existential. It asked a single, persistent question: how long can you maintain hostility before you exhaust yourself? The answer was usually, not as long as she can wait. By the end of their lives, many of these queens were no longer actively resisting anything. Resistance had become unnecessary. Their enemies had adjusted, compromised, or vanished. Power had reorganized itself around them. This is why their stories feel unsatisfying to people expecting drama. There is no final duel. No confession. No apology. The revenge is complete long before anyone admits it happened. Medieval queens did not always get justice. They did not always get happiness. They did not always get peace. But they often got the last word, even if it was spoken quietly, through continuity rather than confrontation. And in a world obsessed with dominance, continuity was subversive, because the most unsettling thing you can do to someone who expects your absence is to remain. Remaining was only part of it. The other part was becoming unavoidable. Medieval queens who mastered revenge without weapons understood that presence alone was not enough. You had to become so embedded in the machinery of power that removing you would cause more damage than tolerating you. This is where patience became strategy rather than endurance. Look at how often queens positioned themselves near succession rather than at its center. Power attached to heirs was harder to attack openly. You could criticize a woman. You could undermine her authority. But attacking the legitimacy of the next king or queen was riskier. Queens who attached themselves to heirs did not need to defend their own authority directly. They defended the future. This was the method of Hedwig of Poland. Crowned in her own right, she ruled with a quiet firmness that unsettled expectations. Hedwig focused not on domination, but on consolidation. She negotiated marriages, stabilized borders, and reinforced legitimacy. Those who doubted her rule found themselves isolated not by force, but by irrelevance. There was no purge. There was no spectacle. There was simply no room left for them. Revenge here was preventative. It denied opponents the future they were planning. Others focused on reshaping institutions so that future resistance became structurally difficult. This was subtle, technical, and deeply effective. Queens who influenced legal reforms, administrative practices, or religious appointments altered the environment itself. Once embedded, these changes outlived their creators. Revenge did not need to be enforced repeatedly. It enforced itself. This is why some medieval women appear constantly in charters and records even when chroniclers try to minimize them. They were everywhere the system mattered. They understood that power resided less in moments of decision and more in who was allowed to make them. Sometimes revenge took the form of selective generosity. A queen who forgave publicly while remembering privately created debts. In a society built on obligation, debts were leverage. Forgiveness could be more dangerous than punishment because it forced loyalty rather than fear. Those who expected retaliation instead received favor. They were now bound. They could not oppose without appearing ungrateful. The queen did not need to threaten them. Their own reputation restrained them. This kind of revenge was nearly invisible. It looked like mercy. It functioned as control. Queens also understood that exile was not always loss. Sometimes it was opportunity. Removed from court, sidelined politically, or sent away under polite excuses, queens often used distance to build alternative networks. Exile removed immediate danger. It also removed surveillance. Correspondence flourished. Alliances formed quietly. Influence traveled even when the queen did not. When these women returned, they were no longer isolated figures. They were nodes in wider systems of loyalty that courts had failed to notice. Revenge arrived not as confrontation, but as re-entry. There is also the question of emotional discipline. Medieval revenge without violence required suppressing visible anger. This was not because anger was unjustified, but because it was unproductive. Emotional restraint frustrated enemies who wanted reaction. Without reaction, they had nothing to measure success against. Queens who mastered this became unreadable. Chroniclers complained about their coldness, their calculation, their lack of visible passion. What they were witnessing was control. Control over self translated into control over outcome. This discipline extended even to moments of apparent defeat. Losses were reframed as delays. Retreats became repositioning. Silence became preparation. In this way, revenge stopped being an event and became a posture. It is tempting to imagine that all of this required exceptional intelligence or extraordinary resources. Sometimes it did. But often it required only one thing: time. Time was the resource most underestimated by medieval power brokers. They planned campaigns, treaties, and marriages around short horizons. They assumed enemies would break, submit, or disappear. Queens who refused to cooperate with those assumptions destabilized entire strategies simply by continuing. Even age became a weapon. Older queens were often dismissed as past relevance. This dismissal gave them freedom. They could advise without scrutiny, influence without challenge, and persist without threat. Their revenge came through longevity. They became fixtures. Removing them felt unnecessary. Ignoring them became impossible. This is why dowager queens were so frequently powerful. They had already survived. They had already lost what could be taken. What remained was influence. Influence unburdened by ambition was unsettling. And then there is the matter of contrast. Queens who ruled competently made incompetence elsewhere more visible. Their revenge against chaos was stability. Against cruelty, fairness. Against unpredictability, consistency. They did not need to criticize. Comparison did the work. When rulers failed, people remembered alternatives. Memory, once formed, did not need encouragement. This is perhaps the most important element of medieval revenge without weapons. It relied on long memory. Not just personal memory, but collective memory. Queens understood that how they were experienced mattered more than how they were described. People remembered who kept the peace. Who ensured food arrived. Who resolved disputes fairly. Who did not disappear during crises. Those memories endured longer than accusations. Enemies might win arguments. Queens won recollection. By the time revenge was complete, it no longer felt like revenge. It felt like the natural order. The queen belonged. Opposition did not. And that is why this form of revenge is so difficult to dramatize and so effective to execute. It leaves no single moment to point to. No act to condemn. No crime to avenge. It leaves only outcome. The medieval world feared this quietly. Not because it was violent, but because it was irreversible. Once power adjusted itself around someone who would not leave, it did not return easily. And so medieval queens waited. They waited through insults, confinement, dismissal, neglect, and erasure attempts. They waited through the rise and fall of men who believed authority was self-evident. They waited through wars they did not start and reforms they were not credited for. They waited because they understood something their enemies did not. That history does not reward urgency. It rewards endurance. Endurance, however, was never passive. That is another misunderstanding that medieval power brokers made repeatedly. Waiting did not mean stagnation. It meant preparation conducted quietly enough that it did not trigger resistance. Queens who practiced this kind of revenge used time to refine their position rather than simply survive within it. They learned who could be trusted and who merely performed loyalty when it was fashionable. They learned which institutions bent easily and which resisted change. They learned where pressure could be applied invisibly. By the time action became necessary, it no longer looked like action. It looked like routine. Routine is dangerous. People stop watching it. This is why so many medieval queens appear in records as constant presences rather than dramatic actors. Their signatures recur. Their names reappear in confirmations, permissions, and negotiations. Nothing seems urgent. Nothing looks revolutionary. And yet, the cumulative effect is unmistakable. Power flows through them. Adversaries often failed to recognize this until it was too late. They mistook calm for weakness and continuity for compliance. By the time they realized that the queen was not waiting to be removed but waiting to be indispensable, the option of removal was already gone. One of the most effective techniques was becoming the default solution to problems. When disputes arose, the queen mediated. When factions argued, the queen negotiated. When legitimacy was questioned, the queen provided it. Over time, even those who resented her authority began to rely on it. Dependency formed quietly. Dependency is a trap that closes without noise. Once dependency existed, revenge no longer required confrontation. Withholding cooperation became enough. A delayed signature. A postponed audience. A neutral silence. These were not acts of aggression. They were administrative realities. And they were deeply effective. Those on the receiving end felt frustration but could not articulate accusation. Nothing improper had occurred. The queen had simply followed procedure. Procedure is difficult to rebel against. This method also protected reputation. Queens who ruled through process rather than force remained blameless even as outcomes favored them. Chroniclers struggled to assign responsibility. They recorded effects without causes. This ambiguity shielded the queen from backlash while still delivering results. Revenge without blame is difficult to undo. Another overlooked aspect is how medieval queens used absence of spectacle as camouflage. Courts expected drama. They expected visible rivalry. When none appeared, attention drifted elsewhere. The queen became background. Background figures are rarely targeted. Invisibility, when chosen, is power. Queens who mastered this could influence decisions without appearing to. They spoke through intermediaries. They suggested rather than demanded. They framed outcomes as consensus rather than direction. Others took credit for results that benefited her. She did not object. Credit is optional. Outcome is not. This approach frustrated rivals who wanted acknowledgement of conflict. Without conflict, there was no victory to claim. Without victory, hostility felt pointless. Energy drained away. Revenge, here, was entropy applied deliberately. It is also important to recognize how these women used restraint to control escalation. In a violent society, escalation was expected. Restraint disrupted that expectation. Enemies prepared for resistance and encountered compliance. They prepared for outrage and encountered silence. They prepared for rebellion and encountered administration. This mismatch exhausted them. They spent resources anticipating threats that never materialized while missing shifts that already had. This psychological toll mattered. Medieval politics was personal. Men expected reactions. They measured power by visible dominance. When denied feedback, they lost orientation. Queens who offered no clear opposition forced adversaries to reveal themselves through impatience. Mistakes followed. Overreach occurred. Legitimacy eroded. At that point, the queen did not need to act. Circumstance acted for her. This is why so many medieval revenge stories involving women end without resolution. There is no reckoning scene. No punishment delivered on screen. The enemy simply fades. Fading is a form of defeat that leaves no martyrs. Martyrs inspire resistance. Irrelevance does not. Queens who understood this avoided creating symbols. They let enemies discredit themselves. They let time dull outrage. They let attention drift, and while attention drifted, governance continued. Governance, repeated long enough, becomes authority. Authority, once normalized, becomes unquestioned. By the time questions arose, they were academic. This is why modern readers sometimes miss the revenge entirely. It does not announce itself. It requires patience to perceive. It requires following the thread across decades rather than moments, but medieval people felt it. They adjusted their behavior accordingly. They negotiated differently. They deferred. They waited for approval. They assumed presence. Assumption is the final stage of power. Once someone's involvement is assumed, their removal feels disruptive. Disruption is avoided unless necessary. Queens who reached this stage had already won. Their revenge was complete long before it was acknowledged. And perhaps that is the quietest cruelty of all. To be wronged, dismissed, confined, or humiliated, and then to win so thoroughly that no one remembers the conflict clearly enough to apologize for it. History moves on. The queen remains in it. There is a moment in many of these stories where revenge becomes indistinguishable from normal life. That moment is important, because it marks the point where resistance has failed completely. When revenge no longer requires intention, when it sustains itself through habit, the conflict is effectively over. Medieval queens understood this intuitively. They did not seek closure. Closure would have required acknowledgement. They preferred normalization. Normalization is the enemy of opposition. Once people grow accustomed to a queen's authority, they stop questioning how it arrived. They remember disruption as inconvenient and stability as deserved. Over time, even those who once opposed her begin to defend the system she represents, not out of loyalty, but out of preference. Change becomes the threat. Continuity becomes safety. This reversal was devastating for those who had expected her removal. It is also why medieval revenge without weapons often left no visible scars. There were no ruined castles to point to, no bloodlines erased in a single stroke. Instead, there were generations shaped subtly by decisions made quietly. The harm was not immediate. It was cumulative. Queens who survived long enough learned how to use repetition as a tool. Repetition of presence. Repetition of procedure. Repetition of outcome. Each repetition reduced resistance. Familiarity dulled outrage. Eventually, opposition felt unreasonable. Unreasonable opposition does not attract allies. This is where many challengers failed. They continued to behave as if the conflict were fresh, even as everyone else had moved on. They sounded angry in a room that was calm. They looked disruptive in a system that had stabilized around someone else. Queens did not need to discredit them. They discredited themselves. Another subtle method was selective memory. Queens remembered slights privately and allowed them to resurface only when useful. There was no immediate punishment. There was no confrontation. Just a note taken and filed away. Years later, when an opportunity arose to deny a favor, delay a request, or redirect support, memory quietly did its work. This kind of revenge was deniable. No one could prove motive. No one could accuse without sounding paranoid. The queen had simply made a decision. Decisions are difficult to argue against when you are not the one making them. It is tempting to imagine that this level of control required extraordinary emotional detachment. In reality, it required discipline. These women felt anger, resentment, grief, and frustration like anyone else. The difference was that they did not allow those emotions to dictate timing. Timing was everything. Acting too early exposed weakness. Acting too late risked irrelevance. Acting quietly, at the moment when action looked like maintenance rather than retaliation, was ideal. This is why revenge often arrived disguised as routine governance. A law enforced. A privilege revoked. An alliance strengthened. None of it dramatic. All of it consequential. Medieval queens also benefited from underestimation even as they resented it. Being underestimated lowered expectations. Lower expectations created space. In that space, influence grew unnoticed. Men expected women in power to fail loudly or submit quietly. They were unprepared for women who succeeded quietly. Quiet success unsettles narratives. It forces revision. Revision takes time. During that time, power consolidates. This pattern explains why some queens appear suddenly powerful in records after years of apparent inactivity. They were never inactive. They were accumulating. Accumulation does not require attention. It requires consistency. Consistency, over decades, reshapes institutions. Institutions then enforce what individuals no longer need to. At that point, revenge has moved beyond the personal. It has become structural. Structural revenge is the most enduring kind. It does not rely on memory or emotion. It functions regardless of intention. Even if the queen herself forgets the original slight, the system remembers. And systems do not forgive. This is perhaps the most unsettling realization for medieval elites who opposed powerful queens. Even if reconciliation occurred, even if personal relationships improved, the consequences remained. Authority once redistributed did not return easily. Queens who restructured power did not need to maintain hostility. Hostility was no longer relevant. Their enemies often did not realize this until they attempted to reassert influence and found no path back. Doors that had once been open were now closed politely. Permanently. This is why some medieval revenge stories feel anticlimactic. There is no moment of triumph because triumph was never the goal. The goal was security. The goal was continuity. The goal was to make further conflict unnecessary. And when that goal was achieved, revenge ceased to be an action and became a condition. The condition of being present. The condition of being consulted. The condition of being assumed. At that stage, even death did not undo the victory. Queens who embedded themselves into governance left successors who inherited stable systems. Their influence echoed through policies, expectations, and traditions. Their enemies, by contrast, often left nothing durable behind them. Their opposition had been reactive. Reaction does not build structures. It only responds to them. Structures outlast reactions. This is why medieval queens who took revenge without lifting a weapon often appear calmer in historical memory than those who fought openly. Calmness was not a personality trait. It was a strategy. Calmness suggested inevitability. Inevitability discourages resistance. Once people believe something is inevitable, they stop trying to change it. At that point, revenge is complete. And it arrives without noise. It arrives without satisfaction. It arrives without acknowledgement. It simply exists. History continues around it. And that, in the medieval world, was the most final outcome possible. What often goes unnoticed is how exhausting it was for everyone else to keep opposing something that refused to react. Resistance thrives on response. It needs friction. When friction disappears, resistance becomes performative, then pointless, and finally embarrassing. Medieval queens who practiced this kind of revenge understood that embarrassment was corrosive. People will tolerate fear longer than they will tolerate ridicule. Ridicule did not need to be spoken aloud. It emerged naturally when opponents repeated the same objections year after year while nothing changed. Their complaints began to sound dated. Their arguments felt tired. Eventually, even their allies stopped listening. This is when revenge reached its most efficient phase. The queen no longer needed to manage opposition. Opposition managed itself into obscurity. Another advantage of this approach was adaptability. Quiet revenge did not lock a queen into a single outcome. Because she had not publicly committed to retaliation, she retained flexibility. She could adjust strategy without appearing inconsistent. Public vengeance limits options. Silent positioning expands them. Adaptability mattered in a medieval world where circumstances shifted constantly. Alliances broke. Kings died unexpectedly. Wars ended abruptly. Plagues rearranged priorities overnight. Queens who tied their revenge to survival rather than spectacle could pivot without losing credibility. This flexibility often allowed them to appear reasonable even while winning. Reasonableness is disarming. Opponents prepared for confrontation and encountered compromise. They prepared for anger and encountered patience. This mismatch created hesitation. Hesitation slowed response. Slowness created opportunity. Queens did not exploit these moments dramatically. They let them accumulate. Accumulation was invisible. Even when revenge involved denial, it was framed as inevitability rather than punishment. Resources were unavailable. Circumstances were unfavorable. Timing was unfortunate. Nothing personal. Nothing confrontational. Just reality. Reality is difficult to argue with. Those on the receiving end sensed intent but could not prove it. Accusations sounded petty. Grievances sounded personal. The queen remained neutral, composed, and justified. Justification is power when it is plausible. This is why medieval revenge without weapons was so effective against hierarchical opposition. Nobles, bishops, and courtiers relied on formal challenges. They expected lines of conflict. When those lines blurred, their tools failed. You cannot duel patience. You cannot besiege continuity. You cannot accuse inevitability. And so resistance eroded. It is also important to note that many of these queens were deeply aware of their visibility. They understood when to be seen and when to recede. Visibility was not constant. It was strategic. They appeared during moments of crisis to reassure stability, then withdrew once order resumed. This created an association between their presence and resolution. Over time, people began to want them nearby during uncertainty. Want is stronger than loyalty. Loyalty can be demanded. Want cannot. This association became self-reinforcing. The more often a queen appeared during moments of calm, the more calm was attributed to her presence. Absence became unsettling. Presence became comforting. At that point, opposition felt irresponsible. No one wants to be blamed for destabilizing something that works. This dynamic allowed queens to reshape power without ever declaring intent. They did not need slogans. They did not need justification. They were simply there when things went well. Their enemies were there when things went poorly. History noticed, even if contemporaries did not articulate it clearly. Another subtle element was restraint in victory. When opportunities arose to humiliate opponents openly, queens often declined. Public humiliation creates sympathy. Quiet sidelining does not. They understood that humiliation invites retaliation. Irrelevance invites nothing. So rivals were not crushed. They were absorbed, redirected, or forgotten. Forgotten is the most complete defeat. This restraint also protected the queen's image. She appeared generous. Reasonable. Above conflict. Even enemies who suspected manipulation struggled to convince others because nothing visibly malicious had occurred. Malice requires proof. Silence leaves none. Over time, the queen's version of events became default. Her decisions shaped daily reality. Reality shapes memory. Memory shapes legitimacy. Legitimacy is what remains when force is unnecessary. Once legitimacy settled, revenge no longer needed maintenance. The system sustained it. And this is perhaps the most unsettling outcome for those who once opposed her. Even if they later gained influence, even if they returned to favor, they did so within a structure shaped by someone else's patience. Their victories were constrained, their options limited. Their autonomy reduced. They lived inside the outcome of revenge long after forgetting its origin. This is why medieval revenge without weapons feels almost unfair. It denies the satisfaction of conflict. It denies the dignity of resistance. It denies the clarity of winners and losers. It simply rearranges the world. Queens who mastered this did not necessarily enjoy it. Many endured isolation, suspicion, and prolonged uncertainty. The cost was high. But the outcome was durable. Durability was the point. In a society obsessed with immediate dominance, durability was radical. Durability outlived outrage. Durability outlasted ambition. Durability survived memory. And so medieval queens waited. They waited not because they lacked power, but because they understood its rhythm. They waited because rushing would have diminished the outcome. They waited because history favors those who can endure discomfort longer than others can maintain hostility. By the time revenge was complete, no one was watching for it anymore. They were simply living inside it. Living inside it was the final irony. The people who had once resisted, dismissed, or confined these queens often adapted so thoroughly that they forgot resistance had ever seemed possible. The new arrangement did not feel imposed. It felt natural. That is the quiet success of revenge that never announces itself. It does not feel like defeat. It feels like adjustment. Adjustment is how power becomes permanent. Medieval queens who reached this stage no longer needed to think about their enemies at all. Opposition had ceased to be personal. It had become abstract, theoretical, something historians would later debate while contemporaries simply carried on with their lives. This is why revenge without weapons leaves such a faint emotional trace in the sources. Chroniclers note outcomes, not motivations. They describe reigns as stable, administrations as effective, transitions as smooth. They rarely pause to ask who had been wronged years earlier or how long someone had waited for circumstances to align. Waiting does not make good drama. But it makes durable reality. Another reason this form of revenge succeeded is that it aligned with medieval expectations about order. Medieval society valued hierarchy, continuity, and legitimacy. Queens who framed their endurance as service to these ideals made resistance seem irresponsible. They were not challenging the system. They were preserving it. Preservation is difficult to oppose without appearing destructive. Even when queens personally resented their treatment, they rarely allowed that resentment to define their public posture. Publicly, they were guardians of stability. Privately, they remembered. Memory did not require expression. It required patience. And patience, in these cases, was not infinite. It was strategic. Queens knew when to stop waiting and allow consequences to unfold. They did not push. They released pressure and let gravity do the work. This restraint is often mistaken for forgiveness. It was not. Forgiveness implies closure. These queens did not seek closure. They sought outcome. Outcomes did not require reconciliation. They required positioning. Positioning was achieved through consistency. By appearing at councils, issuing confirmations, maintaining alliances, and overseeing transitions, queens placed themselves at the center of continuity. Over time, that center hardened. Hardened centers resist disruption. Those who attempted to challenge this position often found themselves arguing against precedent. Precedent is a powerful adversary. It does not argue back. It simply exists. This is how revenge became invisible. It hid inside precedent. Once something had happened long enough, it felt inevitable. And inevitability is immune to moral debate. Moral debate requires choice. Inevitability suggests none. This dynamic explains why some medieval queens are remembered primarily as administrators rather than victims or avengers. Their stories appear unremarkable on the surface. They did not overthrow regimes. They did not execute enemies. They governed. Governance was their reply. In a violent world, governance was quietly defiant. It said that chaos was not the only way to respond to injustice. It said that endurance could be more disruptive than rebellion. It said that time could be weaponized without drawing a blade. This message was deeply unsettling to a culture built on displays of dominance. And yet, it worked. The queens who practiced this form of revenge were not anomalies. They were products of their environment who learned how to operate within constraints rather than collide with them. They understood the limits placed on them and used those limits as cover. Cover allowed movement. Movement, even slow movement, accumulates distance. Distance changes perspective. From a distance, the original conflict shrinks. The insult fades. The imprisonment becomes a detail. What remains is position. Position determines outcome. This is why medieval revenge without weapons often feels unsatisfying to retell. There is no catharsis. No reversal scene. No moment when the wronged party confronts their oppressor and demands acknowledgement. Acknowledgement was unnecessary. The outcome spoke. And the outcome was that the queen remained. Remaining was not dramatic. It was effective. Over decades, this effectiveness reshaped expectations. People began to assume that queens could rule, advise, govern, and endure. The precedent created by one queen enabled the next. Revenge extended beyond the individual into the structure of possibility. This may be the most lasting revenge of all. Not the defeat of a single enemy, but the erosion of an assumption, the assumption that women would disappear. They did not, they stayed. They governed. They waited. And while others rushed toward immediate victories that dissolved quickly, these queens built outcomes that persisted quietly, long after the original conflict had been forgotten. In the medieval world, where legacy mattered more than intention, that was the final measure of success. Revenge without weapons did not scream. It settled. And once settled, it was very difficult to remove. Settlement is an interesting word in medieval contexts. It suggests peace, stability, and resolution, but it can also mean occupation. The quiet kind. Medieval queens who achieved this kind of revenge occupied the political landscape so thoroughly that there was no empty space left for opposition to reclaim. Everything important already belonged to routine. Routine is the least dramatic form of control, and the most reliable. Once routines are established, people organize their lives around them. They stop imagining alternatives. They stop preparing for disruption. The queen's presence becomes part of the background architecture of power, like walls you no longer notice until they are gone. This is why attempts to remove such queens later often failed spectacularly. Removal did not feel corrective. It felt destructive. Even former enemies hesitated, not out of affection, but out of fear of destabilizing what had become familiar. Familiarity is persuasive. Medieval politics thrived on certainty. War, famine, and succession crises made life unpredictable. Any figure who reduced uncertainty gained quiet loyalty. Queens who ruled patiently offered predictability. That alone made them valuable. Value creates protection. Protection does not require love. It requires usefulness. This is where many male rivals miscalculated. They assumed legitimacy was emotional or symbolic. They underestimated practicality. People tolerate many things in power. They do not tolerate instability for long. Queens who delivered stability did not need to argue their right to rule. They demonstrated it. Demonstration is stronger than declaration. This approach also allowed them to absorb criticism without consequence. Complaints existed, but they lacked urgency. Nothing was on fire. Nothing was collapsing. Without crisis, criticism remained abstract. Abstract criticism rarely mobilizes action. Action requires discomfort. Queens minimized discomfort. This was not kindness. It was control. They knew that as long as daily life functioned, opposition would remain theoretical. And theoretical opposition fades. Over time, even those who remembered earlier injustices adjusted. Memory softened. Details blurred. What remained was the present arrangement. The present always feels heavier than the past. This is another reason revenge without weapons was so effective. It did not rely on keeping anger alive. It allowed anger to dissipate while outcome solidified. Anger is volatile. Outcome is durable. Queens chose outcome. It is also worth noting how often this strategy protected them from moral scrutiny. Because their revenge did not involve visible harm, it was difficult to condemn. Chroniclers could criticize ambition, temperament, or influence, but they struggled to frame governance itself as wrongdoing. Running things competently is an awkward crime. So accusations became personal rather than political. Queens were called cold, manipulative, or unfeminine. These critiques did not translate into action. They circulated, then dissipated. Meanwhile, administration continued. This imbalance exhausted critics. They complained while the queen ruled. Complaints did not change outcomes. Over time, complaining felt futile. Futility discourages persistence. And so resistance withered. It is important to understand that this form of revenge did not require moral superiority. Queens were not necessarily gentler or fairer than their rivals. They were simply better suited to long timelines. Long timelines favor patience over aggression. Aggression consumes resources quickly. Patience consumes time. Time was abundant for those willing to endure. Queens often had fewer immediate options than men. This constraint forced creativity. They learned to operate within narrow corridors. Those corridors became paths. Paths became systems. Systems became barriers. Barriers do not look like enemies. They look like reality. By the time rivals recognized the barrier, they had already accepted it. This is why revenge without weapons is so difficult to interrupt. It does not escalate. It settles. Interrupting it requires disruption, which carries risk. Most people avoid risk unless forced. Queens did not force. They waited. Waiting was their leverage. This patience also allowed them to benefit from mistakes they did not make. Rivals overreached. Allies betrayed each other. External pressures shifted priorities. Queens remained consistent. Consistency looked increasingly attractive. Attraction does not need coercion. People move toward what works. Eventually, the queen became the reference point. Decisions were measured against her approach. Stability was defined by her presence. Absence became the anomaly. Anomaly invites correction. Correction restores what is familiar. And so even after a queen's death, the structure she left behind often persisted. Regents followed precedent. Councils preserved procedures. Successors inherited expectations. The revenge outlived the revenger. This is perhaps the most unsettling outcome of all. The original wrong fades completely. No one remembers why the queen needed revenge in the first place. They remember only that she ruled. Her enemies, by contrast, are remembered for disruption, failure, or short-sightedness. History is not kind to those who lose quietly. But it is ruthless to those who lose slowly without noticing. This is the final shape of medieval revenge without lifting a weapon. It does not correct the past. It replaces it. It does not punish enemies directly. It makes them irrelevant to the future. Queens who achieved this did not need vindication. They had continuity. And continuity, in the medieval world, was victory in its most complete form. Continuity has a peculiar effect on perception. Once something has lasted long enough, people begin to assume it was always meant to be that way. The human mind is uncomfortable with instability, and so it retroactively smooths history. What began as endurance becomes destiny. Medieval queens benefited from this tendency more than their rivals ever realized. When a queen remained present through multiple reigns, councils, or crises, her survival alone began to look intentional. It did not matter whether her rise had been accidental, contested, or resisted. Longevity reframed it as inevitability. And inevitability silences questions. Questions require the belief that things could be otherwise. Most people stop believing that once a pattern holds. This is where revenge without weapons crosses into something more abstract. It stops being personal. It becomes structural. The queen no longer needs to remember who wronged her, because the system no longer allows those wrongs to be repeated in the same way. The door that once closed on her no longer exists. Not because it was smashed open, but because the building was redesigned around her presence. This redesign was slow and subtle. Offices shifted. Ceremonies adjusted. Protocols evolved. Small changes, individually forgettable, collectively transformative. Transformation does not announce itself. It accumulates, and accumulation is difficult to reverse. This is why later generations often struggle to understand the resistance these queens initially faced. Looking backward, opposition appears irrational. Why would anyone object to something that works so well? The answer is that it did not always look inevitable. But inevitability is a product of time. Time favors those who can wait without fracturing. Many medieval queens learned early that visible frustration was dangerous. Anger invited scrutiny. Scrutiny invited intervention. Intervention rarely favored them. So they practiced emotional restraint as a form of survival. Survival became strategy. Strategy became habit. Habit became identity. By the time others noticed how central the queen had become, challenging her felt like challenging order itself. Order has defenders even when individuals do not. This is another quiet advantage of revenge without spectacle. It recruits defenders who do not realize they are defending anything personal. They are defending routine, predictability, and their own sense of safety. People fight harder for those things than for abstract justice. Justice is negotiable. Routine is sacred. Queens understood this instinctively, even if they never articulated it. They aligned themselves with the maintenance of daily life. Food distribution. Court schedules. Diplomatic continuity. Legal confirmation, nothing dramatic. Nothing heroic. Just reliable presence. Reliability does something extraordinary in volatile environments. It becomes authority. Authority does not need force when it is trusted. Trust grows when nothing goes wrong. And nothing went wrong often enough that it is tempting to imagine these queens as cold or calculating, but that simplifies something more complex. Many of them experienced profound loneliness. Waiting is isolating. Patience does not receive applause. Endurance rarely feels noble while it is happening, but they endured anyway. Not because endurance was virtuous, but because it was effective. Effectiveness does not require approval. Only results. Over time, the emotional cost of waiting faded into irrelevance compared to the structural outcomes. The queen's personal feelings became historically invisible. What remained was governance. History remembers structures better than emotions. This is why the revenge itself disappears from the record. There is no moment to point to. No decisive confrontation. No reversal scene. Just a gradual recentering of power until resistance no longer made sense. Sense is contextual. Change the context, and resistance becomes confusion. Confusion dissolves movements. Movements require clarity. Clarity requires conflict. Queens removed conflict by refusing to escalate it. They did not deny injustice. They outlasted it. Outlasting injustice does not heal it, but it renders it obsolete. Obsolescence is a form of victory that leaves no scars visible to later generations. And that is why medieval revenge without weapons feels so unsettling when examined closely. It denies the emotional narrative we expect. There is no release, no catharsis, no redemption arc, there is only persistence. Persistence reshapes reality quietly. Reality, once reshaped, resists reinterpretation. By the time anyone realizes what has happened, it is already ordinary. And ordinary things are rarely challenged. They are lived with. They are depended on. They are protected. So the queen remains, not as an avenger, not as a victim, but as a fixture. A presence so normalized that imagining the world without her feels strange. Strangeness discourages action. Action threatens comfort. Comfort is guarded fiercely. This is the final transformation. Revenge ceases to be an act and becomes an environment. No one enforces it. No one announces it. It simply surrounds everyone involved. They breathe it. They plan within it. They grow accustomed to it. And in that quiet acclimation, the past loses its power to harm. Not because it was forgiven, but because it was rendered irrelevant. Irrelevance is the end state most people never consider when they think about revenge. They imagine reversal, humiliation, punishment. Medieval queens imagined something else entirely: replacement. Not of people, but of assumptions. Assumptions are the scaffolding of power. Remove them quietly, and the structure above adjusts without collapse. This is why the most effective revenge rarely looks like revenge at all. It looks like adaptation. It looks like competence. It looks like patience mistaken for passivity. Mistaken by those who believe power must announce itself. The medieval world rewarded noise, spectacle, and force, at least in the short term. Knights charged. Kings declared. Lords rebelled. Chroniclers recorded drama. But beneath all that noise ran a slower current, one that favored those who could endure the aftermath. Queens learned to live in that current. They watched crises come and go. They learned that most threats burned hot and fast, leaving exhaustion behind. They learned that those who rushed toward confrontation often depleted their own leverage. Leverage was precious. So they conserved it. They spoke when necessary. They remained silent when advantageous. They remembered slights without reacting to them. Reaction would have given those slights shape and energy. Silence let them fade while the queen stayed. Staying was the victory condition. In many cases, these queens did not need to defeat their enemies directly. Time did it for them. Rivals aged, lost allies, made mistakes, or became entangled in conflicts elsewhere. The queen remained a constant reference point while others rotated through ambition and failure. Constancy breeds trust. Trust breeds dependency. Dependency creates power. None of this required confrontation. It required presence. Presence is underrated because it feels passive. But presence, sustained over years, reshapes expectations more thoroughly than force ever could. People begin to plan around it. They stop questioning it. They defend it reflexively. This reflex is what finally sealed the queen's position. By the time opposition noticed the shift, they were no longer arguing against a person. They were arguing against habit. Habit is difficult to dislodge. Habit does not need justification. It simply is. This is why late challenges to such queens often sounded irrational or dangerous. Why disturb something that functions? Why risk uncertainty? Why reopen old conflicts when the present feels stable? These questions answered themselves. And so revenge completed its arc. Not with a final act, but with exhaustion. Opponents tired of resisting something that no longer looked like an enemy. Their energy dissipated. Their narratives lost coherence. Without conflict to sustain them, grievances dissolved into nostalgia. Nostalgia is harmless. It does not mobilize. It reminisces. Meanwhile, the queen's influence extended beyond her own lifetime. Daughters learned by observation. Court officials absorbed procedures. Successors inherited norms that no longer felt negotiable. The queen's endurance became instructional. This is perhaps the most profound consequence of revenge without weapons: it educates the future. It teaches what works. It discourages what does not. Without ever issuing a lesson, it becomes one. Later rulers, especially women, benefited from these quiet precedents. They stepped into spaces that had already been normalized. They encountered resistance, but of a different kind, less certain, less absolute, because someone had stayed before. Staying changes what seems possible. Possibility is the raw material of power, and power, once redefined, does not revert easily. This is why medieval queens who practiced this form of revenge are difficult to categorize. They were not rebels. They were not martyrs. They were not conquerors. They were continuities. Continuity does not inspire slogans. But it outlasts them. In the end, revenge without weapons did not seek emotional satisfaction. It did not seek acknowledgement. It did not seek apology. It sought permanence. And permanence, achieved quietly, proved far more unsettling to those who once believed they had won. Because winning, it turned out, was not about the moment. It was about who remained when the moment passed. And the queen remained. Chronicles prefer turning points, betrayals, battles, coronations. They struggle with slow victories, with power that accrues quietly like dust in a room no one checks anymore. But medieval revenge, in its most effective form, lived exactly there, in the unremarkable persistence that outlasted spectacle. Once a ruler, noble, or queen achieved this state of permanence, something subtle changed in the political environment around them. Conflict did not disappear. It redirected. Rivals stopped targeting the person and began targeting circumstances instead. Poor harvests. Foreign threats. Religious disputes. Anything except the figure who had become immovable. This redirection was itself a sign of defeat. When people stop attacking you directly, they have accepted that you are not the problem they can solve. Medieval revenge was rarely about destroying an enemy outright. That was expensive, risky, and often temporary. Killing a rival removed a body, not an idea. Replacing a rival removed neither. But outlasting them rendered both irrelevant. Irrelevance was the quietest form of erasure. Many medieval figures learned this lesson the hard way. Lords who relied on terror found themselves surrounded by silence once fear stopped working. Kings who ruled by spectacle discovered that admiration evaporated the moment success stalled. Warriors who built reputations on victory found no replacement identity when age slowed them down. Those who survived longest were not the strongest. They were the most adaptable. Adaptation required restraint. Restraint required patience. Patience required absorbing insult without responding. This was not moral superiority. It was strategy. To respond too early was to reveal vulnerability. To react visibly was to grant importance to the insult. Silence forced the aggressor to escalate, and escalation exposed desperation. Desperation is never attractive in politics. It makes allies nervous. It makes neutrals cautious. It makes enemies bold, but briefly. Boldness without stability burns out quickly. This is why many medieval revenge stories appear incomplete. There is no final reckoning scene. No villain kneeling. No justice speech. No cathartic resolution. Instead, there is drift. The enemy drifts out of relevance. Their allies drift away. Their influence erodes. Their name stops appearing in correspondence. Their presence at court becomes optional. Optional becomes unnecessary. Unnecessary becomes forgotten. Forgotten is final. The person who waited is still there, issuing orders, signing documents, shaping marriages, approving appointments. Not loudly. Not triumphantly. Simply doing the work. Work is an underestimated weapon. Work continues when emotions cool. Work compounds. Work leaves records. Records become precedent. Precedent becomes law. And law, once established, becomes very difficult to argue against without sounding unreasonable. This is how revenge embedded itself into systems. The medieval world loved systems, even when it pretended to worship individuals. Titles, customs, hierarchies, rituals, all mechanisms designed to stabilize power. The clever avenger did not fight these mechanisms. They inserted themselves into them. Once inside, removal required more energy than most rivals could afford. Energy was limited. Wars were costly. Rebellions disrupted trade. Excommunication carried risks. Most people preferred tolerable frustration over catastrophic uncertainty. So they tolerated. Tolerance solidified. The Avenger became normalized. This normalization is the final stage. At this point, even criticism sounds strange. Complaints are met with confusion. That's how things are, people say. Or worse, that's how they've always been. Always is a powerful word in a world obsessed with lineage and tradition. Once revenge reaches the point of always, it no longer needs defense. It no longer even needs intention. It persists on its own. And that is when the original insult truly loses its power. Because it no longer defines the story. The story has moved on. The Avenger has outlived the grievance. This is not forgiveness. Forgiveness requires closure. This is continuation. Continuation denies closure entirely. It leaves the offender trapped in a moment that everyone else has abandoned. They remember the conflict. No one else does. They remember the slight. The system does not. They remember the injustice. The world has reorganized around it. This asymmetry is devastating. To be haunted by something history has forgotten is a uniquely medieval punishment. In an era obsessed with legacy, memory was survival. To lose relevance was to lose existence. And so medieval revenge, when executed with patience, achieved something extraordinary. It erased the enemy not by force, but by progress. Not by confrontation, but by replacement. Not by anger, but by time. Time was the most reliable ally medieval avengers ever had. It aged their enemies. It tested alliances. It exposed weaknesses. It rewarded consistency. Those who could wait learned this. Those who could not became lessons. And the lessons remained long after the people did. Time, however, was not neutral. It never is. Time favors those who understand how to occupy it. Most people assume waiting is empty, that nothing happens while you wait. Medieval survivors understood the opposite. Waiting was active. It was observation. It was accumulation. It was preparation disguised as endurance. Those who waited learned patterns. They learned who panicked under pressure and who became reliable. They learned which alliances held only when convenient and which endured embarrassment. They learned which promises were forgotten and which were quietly honored. This knowledge could not be gathered in moments of chaos. It required stillness. Stillness frightened medieval elites. A ruler not reacting was unsettling. A rival not protesting was suspicious. Silence was interpreted as weakness, until suddenly it wasn't. And by the time others realized silence had been strength, the waiting figure had already moved several steps ahead. Movement, when it finally came, was understated. No announcements. No declarations. Just small adjustments. A marriage arranged here. A tax restructured there. A local official replaced with someone more loyal. A favor granted that created obligation. An obligation that created dependence. Dependence that created loyalty. Loyalty that required no enforcement. Enforcement was expensive. This is why the most effective medieval revenge rarely involved punishment. Punishment created resentment. Resentment required management. Management required force, force was unstable. But obligation was stable. If someone owed you everything, they did not need to be threatened. They protected you voluntarily. They defended you reflexively. They justified your actions publicly without being asked. Justification is power's invisible armor. This is how revenge dissolved into governance. The original insult, betrayal, humiliation, these became irrelevant once systems were in place. The Avenger no longer needed to remember the grievance actively. The system remembered it for them, encoded in who held authority and who did not. Those who once held power found themselves excluded from decision-making. Not formally. Just practically. They were not consulted. They were informed late. They were invited to ceremonies but not to councils. Their opinions were acknowledged politely and then ignored. Polite ignorance is devastating. It denies the drama of opposition. It offers no resistance to fight against. It starves grievance of oxygen. Over time, even the aggrieved began to doubt themselves. Was the insult really that serious? Was the loss truly unjust? Or had time simply moved on? Self-doubt is the final victory. Medieval chroniclers often missed this stage because it lacked spectacle. They recorded wars, not marginalization. They documented executions, not exclusion. Yet exclusion reshaped history more thoroughly than violence ever did. Those excluded lost relevance. Their heirs inherited less, their names faded. Their banners were folded. Their estates fragmented. Meanwhile, the waiting figure's influence extended horizontally and vertically, across regions and generations. This influence did not demand loyalty. It assumed it. Assumption is powerful. People conform to assumed expectations instinctively. They fulfill roles they believe already belong to them. This is how authority became self-sustaining. At this stage, revenge no longer required intent. Even if the avenger forgot the original wrong, the outcome remained. The system continued to reward patience and punish impulsiveness. The irony is sharp. Those who insulted, betrayed, or humiliated often believed they were acting decisively. They believed action was strength. They believed dominance required immediate assertion. They were correct in the short term. They were wrong in the long one. The medieval world was brutal, but it was also slow. Messages traveled at the speed of horses. Decisions took months to manifest. Reputations spread unevenly. Memory lingered. In such a world, speed was not always an advantage. Endurance was. Endurance absorbed shocks. Endurance outlasted mistakes. Endurance turned survival into strategy. This is why medieval revenge stories, when examined closely, often invert modern expectations. The loud avengers burned brightly and briefly. The quiet ones shaped centuries. Their revenge did not satisfy emotionally. It satisfied structurally. It did not feel like victory. It felt like normalcy. And normalcy, once established, is nearly impossible to overthrow without extraordinary effort. Extraordinary effort was rare. Most people adapted instead. Adaptation favored those already in place. And so the cycle completed itself. The waiting figure became the reference point. Their presence became unremarkable, their authority unquestioned. Their revenge invisible. Invisible things endure the longest. Because no one thinks to remove what they no longer notice. This was the ultimate medieval revenge. Not domination. Not destruction. But permanence so complete it felt inevitable. Inevitability is the final disguise of power. Once something feels inevitable, resistance stops feeling heroic and starts feeling foolish. Medieval societies were deeply sensitive to this shift. They followed strength, yes, but more importantly, they followed what appeared stable. Stability promised survival. Instability promised famine, invasion, and chaos. Those who mastered revenge through patience understood this instinctively. They did not try to convince people they were right. Convincing invites argument. Argument invites opposition. Instead, they made themselves unavoidable. Present in every decision. Necessary to every process. Referenced in every plan. Necessity is stronger than legitimacy. Legitimacy can be debated. Necessity cannot. This is why some medieval figures never bothered repairing their reputations. Reputation required narrative control, which required attention. Attention was volatile. They focused instead on becoming functionally indispensable. If trade passed through your lands, merchants defended you. If justice depended on your courts, citizens tolerated you. If appointments required your approval, nobles respected you. Not because they loved you. Because life worked better when you remained. This practical acceptance was more durable than loyalty. Loyalty could flip. Practicality rarely did. Over time, this practicality rewrote memory. Children grew up knowing only the current order. They learned names associated with authority without learning the conflicts that placed them there. The original struggle faded into anecdote. Anecdotes do not inspire rebellion. They entertain. They warn. But they do not mobilize. The enemy, meanwhile, lived with memory. They remembered how things were supposed to be. They remembered when power felt within reach, they remembered insults vividly because nothing replaced them. This imbalance was cruel. One side lived in the present. The other lived in the past. History favors the present. This is why revenge that relies on waiting feels unsatisfying in stories. There is no release. No emotional payoff. No moment of triumph. But medieval politics was not a story. It was an ecosystem. And ecosystems reward what endures. Those who waited learned to let others exhaust themselves. Rivals overreached. Kings overtaxed. Lords rebelled prematurely. Each mistake thinned their support, the waiting figure did not intervene. Intervention would have implicated them. Silence allowed blame to land elsewhere, blame is heavy. People drop it on the nearest target, those already struggling could not carry it. So they collapsed. Collapse created openings. Openings were filled quietly. This quiet filling is how revenge advanced without resistance. By the time opposition noticed consolidation, the moment for action had passed. Resistance now required coordination. Coordination required trust. Trust required leadership. Leadership had already been absorbed. This absorption was not dramatic. It was procedural. Procedures are powerful because they feel neutral. Who appoints officials? Who confirms taxes? Who negotiates treaties? Who resolves disputes? Who decides succession? Each answer narrowed options. Each narrowing reduced risk. Reduced risk encouraged compliance. Compliance became habit. Habit became tradition. Tradition became justification. And justification eliminated the need for force. Force, once unnecessary, was a liability. Those who relied on it appeared unstable. Those who did not appeared legitimate. Legitimacy, retroactively applied, erased the past. The original injustice became irrelevant to governance. Governance defined reality. This is the moment revenge completed its transformation. It stopped being personal. It became structural. Structures do not feel anger. They do not feel satisfaction. They simply persist. This persistence explains why some medieval wrongs were never corrected. Not because they were forgiven, but because the system built on them functioned too well to dismantle. Functionality trumps morality in most historical contexts. Medieval people understood this, even if they disliked it. They aligned themselves with what worked. Those who waited ensured that what worked included them. And excluded those who wronged them. Exclusion, when normalized, is absolute. There is no appeal against normality. No one rebels against what feels natural. They rebel against disruption. By becoming the opposite of disruption, the Avenger secured immunity. At this stage, even open hostility failed. Attacks against the established order were framed as threats to stability, not acts of justice. Rebels became villains. Defenders became heroes. History adjusted accordingly. This adjustment was subtle but permanent. It did not erase facts. It recontextualized them. Context determines meaning. Meaning determines memory. Memory determines legacy. And legacy is the currency medieval elites valued above all else. In the end, revenge achieved its highest form. Not punishment. Not humiliation. But authorship. The Avenger wrote the terms by which the past would be understood. Those who once believed they controlled the narrative found themselves footnotes. Those who waited became chapters. And chapters outlast footnotes every time. Authorship is the quietest but most absolute form of revenge. In medieval society, where memory, precedent, and ritual dictated behavior, controlling the narrative meant controlling reality itself. Once the Avenger dictated what was remembered, what was recorded, and what was celebrated, or ignored, they had already won. Opponents could rage, plead, or protest, but their actions no longer shaped outcomes. They became characters in a story they did not write. This is why patience was more effective than swords. While the impulsive Avenger or the furious Lord acted immediately, expending energy in visible displays of power, the patient figure accumulated influence through continuity. Each day spent ruling, observing, and quietly asserting authority was another brick laid in the foundation of permanent control. In medieval politics, foundations mattered more than fireworks. Foundations were invisible to the untrained eye. A battlefield victory could be witnessed, celebrated, and recorded. Foundations were only visible when something collapsed. And by the time collapse was possible, those who had been patient often held all the levers of survival and governance. This slow, methodical strategy required emotional discipline. It demanded the ability to endure insult, humiliation, and apparent weakness. The Avenger had to act as though the original grievance did not matter, even as they mentally catalogued every slight. These mental records became guides for action, informing choices, alliances, and timing. Every delay was deliberate, every perceived inaction purposeful. Timing was crucial. A mistake made too early could provoke retaliation. A move made too late could allow rivals to recover. Mastery of temporal dynamics, the rhythm of events, the flow of alliances, the natural attrition of opponents, was as lethal as any army. Even subtle gestures could carry immense weight. Granting favor to the right ally at the right moment could shift loyalties, while ignoring a rival's protest could erode their credibility. Patience turned ordinary administrative acts into instruments of influence. The mundane became strategic. Everyday decisions accumulated into structural advantage. Those who once wielded power aggressively were often unaware of the shift until it was complete. Their strategies assumed opposition would be met with conflict, retaliation, or public spectacle. Instead, they encountered calm competence. They faced procedures that reinforced authority quietly. Their complaints bounced off routines designed to consolidate influence. Slowly, inexorably, they became irrelevant to the decisions that shaped the world around them. Irrelevance is often underestimated as a form of domination. It removes an opponent's agency without resistance, leaving them alive but powerless. Medieval figures understood the psychological potency of this. Humiliation can be endured, death can be mourned. Oblivion, however, isolates the mind and erodes legacy. Those who wronged the patient Avenger experienced repeated frustration, aware of their failure, powerless to correct it, and forced to observe the enduring presence of the one they sought to harm. Meanwhile, the Avenger, still alive and active, cemented authority. The original grievance no longer needed public acknowledgement. It had been converted into permanence. Every policy, alliance, and administrative act reinforced their position. The system itself became a silent witness to their triumph. This structural approach to revenge blurred the line between governance and vengeance. Administrative competence, patience, and longevity were instruments of power. They were also forms of retribution. By controlling continuity, the Avenger ensured that those who had wronged them would never regain comparable influence. They did not destroy, they outlasted. Outlasting is subtle but devastating. Unlike battlefield victories, which can be reversed or forgotten over decades, the outcomes of patient endurance accumulate generationally. By the time history records the full extent of influence, rivals are footnotes, often misrepresented as mere obstacles rather than active participants in the original conflict. The Avenger shapes not only the present but also the collective memory of events. Memory in the medieval world was inseparable from power. Control what people remember, and you control their understanding of legitimacy, success, and authority. Patient Avengers manipulated memory not through falsification but by enduring while others faltered. Presence replaced narrative. Participation replaced argument. Survival became evidence. Authority was established simply by being there consistently. This is why revenge through endurance was often more effective than revenge through violence. Violence is immediate, visible, and gratifying, but fleeting. It provokes reaction, breeds chaos, and leaves legacies contested. Endurance is invisible yet irreversible. It shapes both contemporaneous events and historical interpretation. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the Avenger had become inseparable from the political landscape itself. Even centuries later, historians see the effects: stable administrations, continued influence of a ruling lineage, norms established by a patient figure, decisions taken for granted, and rivals relegated to historical footnotes. The revenge is complete not in spectacle but in permanence. Presence, patience, and permanence form a triad of power that medieval Avengers mastered with terrifying subtlety. They understood that force and spectacle could achieve immediate results, but that only endurance could guarantee irreversibility. A sword could kill a rival, it could not ensure that the structures, alliances, and loyalties that once upheld that rival would crumble in a way favorable to the Avenger. That required time, strategy, and above all, silence. Silence is not emptiness. It is a tool. It allows opponents to act, fail, and exhaust themselves. It allows the patient Avenger to observe, catalogue, and plan. In medieval contexts, where communication was slow and influence relied heavily on personal networks and reputation, this quiet form of power was exceptionally potent. Those who rushed, whether to war, negotiation, or retaliation, often misjudged timing. They expended resources without achieving the long-term advantage that patience ensured. Consider how small, repeated administrative decisions could accumulate into irreversible advantage. A loyal steward appointed to a minor castle could later influence military outcomes. A marriage alliance formed quietly could shift entire regional loyalties decades later. Patronage of a merchant or cleric could secure economic and political networks that persisted long after rivals had died. Each action, while seemingly mundane, became a layer of leverage that no one could easily contest. Medieval Avengers also understood human psychology better than their opponents. Those who reacted impulsively were rewarded with temporary satisfaction: a captured city, a public humiliation, a successful assassination. But the consequences were often immediate retaliation, instability, and long-term resource drain. By contrast, those who endured, bided their time, and subtly consolidated power caused exhaustion and confusion among rivals. When resistance faltered, it did so not because it was crushed violently, but because it had overextended itself while the patient figure remained calm and unperturbed. This kind of revenge requires a tolerance for invisibility. Unlike dramatic gestures, it is rarely recorded in chronicles in a way that reads as triumph. Most observers see only ordinary governance, routine decision-making, and adherence to precedent. Yet beneath this appearance lies deliberate calculation, a strategic shaping of reality that rewards endurance above all else. By the time rivals realized what had happened, it was too late. They were no longer influencing outcomes, shaping alliances, or participating in the critical decisions of their world. The Avenger had long since occupied those roles, secured those loyalties, and ingrained their presence into the fabric of political life. Persistence transforms perception. Actions once deemed passive now appear decisive. Decisions once overlooked now seem inevitable. Structures that seemed neutral reveal themselves as instruments of control. The patient Avenger is no longer just a person, they have become a framework. To challenge them is to challenge the environment itself. This is why medieval revenge often outlives the individual. It does not require continued hostility or even continued awareness of the original grievance. The systems established, the precedents set, and the influence extended persist long after the avenger has passed. Successors inherit a world shaped to favor continuity, a world in which the original oppressor's power has faded into irrelevance. Revenge, in this context, is a legacy. It is not spectacle, it is survival. It is not anger, it is strategy. And it is not fleeting, it is embedded in the very structures of society, so enduring that even future generations feel its effects without knowing its origin. This quiet form of dominance reshapes expectations. It teaches others, often indirectly, that patience, endurance, and strategic presence are more formidable than rash aggression. It creates an invisible standard: those who act too quickly fail, those who endure succeed, and those who attempt to disrupt the system meet exhaustion or irrelevance. In the medieval world, this was the ultimate insult to rivals. They could not fight it, negotiate against it, or even acknowledge it without demonstrating their own failure. Revenge became not a moment, but a continuum. It was the slow, imperceptible, unbroken assertion of survival and influence over those who had assumed they held the advantage. To witness it, for those involved, was disorienting. One day, the avenger seemed weak, marginal, or ignored. Decades later, they were indispensable, central, and untouchable. The past grievances no longer mattered. The world had adapted to their endurance. And the original oppressors, meanwhile, were left staring at structures they had helped build but no longer controlled. This is the paradox of long-term revenge: it is invisible yet absolute, patient yet inevitable, subtle yet devastating. Influence in the medieval world was cumulative. Each small act, each quiet decision, each moment of endurance built upon the last. Patience was not passive, it was a slow accumulation of leverage that rival lords, kings, or queens often failed to notice until it was too late. Those who rushed sought immediate advantage, but in doing so, they exposed themselves to the attrition that patience quietly administered over decades. This is why medieval revenge often required invisibility. Public displays, while satisfying in the moment, gave opponents information. They could anticipate retaliation, organize defenses, and attempt countermeasures. Silence, by contrast, concealed intent. It allowed the avenger to operate under the radar, steadily consolidating power while the opposition exhausted itself on perceived opportunities. In this context, the most effective revenge was indistinguishable from ordinary governance. Governance itself became the instrument of vengeance. Policies, appointments, and the quiet redistribution of influence created a landscape in which opponents could no longer act without resistance. Every alliance quietly formed, every obligation leveraged, every favor granted strategically served to undermine the power of those who had once inflicted harm. The avenger did not merely outlast enemies, they reshaped the world so subtly that resisting them became nearly impossible. Patience also allowed the medieval avenger to exploit mistakes made by others. Humans are prone to error, especially under stress. Rivals who acted impulsively often overreached, revealing weaknesses or alienating allies. Those who waited could observe these mistakes, adapt, and capitalize on them at precisely the right moment. The timing of action, therefore, was critical. Move too early, and you waste advantage. Move too late, and opportunities slip away. The patient avenger mastered this rhythm. Endurance also transformed perception. A ruler who consistently survived challenges, whether rebellion, foreign intervention, or court intrigue, came to seem inevitable. Their authority became naturalized. By simply remaining, they demonstrated competence, reliability, and stability. In a society obsessed with lineage, inheritance, and precedent, inevitability was a form of power far more durable than brute force. This slow consolidation of influence also affected memory. Chroniclers often recorded dramatic battles, executions, or public humiliations, but the quiet accumulation of authority over decades left less obvious traces. Yet its impact was profound. Those who had once wielded power aggressively found themselves sidelined, ignored, or marginalized, their influence gradually replaced by a patient presence that had earned trust, loyalty, and procedural dominance. Once entrenched, the Avenger rarely needed to act overtly. Their authority became self-reinforcing. Allies defended them instinctively, adversaries avoided direct confrontation, and institutions adapted to their presence. The structures themselves, legal systems, administrative routines, financial obligations, served as instruments of their continuing influence. Even after death, successors inherited a world shaped by patience, endurance, and strategic foresight. This form of revenge extended beyond individual grievance. It reshaped political ecosystems. By embedding authority into routine, patience ensured continuity. Those who had underestimated or wronged the Avenger were removed not violently, but systematically, through the inertia of established practice. Their failures became invisible, absorbed into the system, while the patient figure's influence remained central and enduring. Transformed conflict into structure, and grievance into governance. The Avenger did not merely survive, they dictated the terms by which survival itself would be measured. By controlling presence, continuity, and procedure, they ensured that those who once threatened them became irrelevant, not through destruction, but through omission and systemic marginalization. In this way, the quiet, patient Avenger rewrote the rules of the game. They demonstrated that in the medieval world, true revenge was not measured by immediate retaliation, public spectacle, or violent triumph, but by endurance, strategic patience, and the ability to reshape the political landscape so completely that resistance became inconceivable. Resistance is exhausting. In the medieval world, those who rushed, reacted, or sought immediate vengeance often found themselves trapped in cycles of fatigue and error. Meanwhile, the patient Avenger thrived quietly, accumulating influence while others burned themselves out. Time became their ally, fatigue their weapon, and consistency their shield. Endurance reshaped perception in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Rivals saw the patient figure survive crises, endure insults, and maintain authority while others fell. This consistency created the illusion of inevitability. In medieval societies, where hierarchy, precedent, and routine dominated, inevitability was a form of power stronger than any army. If someone seemed meant to be in charge, people followed, even those who had once sought to oppose them. This illusion of inevitability allowed the patient Avenger to consolidate influence without spectacle. Minor decisions, small favors, and strategic appointments built an invisible network of loyalty. Administration itself became a tool of revenge. Laws were enforced consistently, alliances were nurtured quietly, and obligations were collected methodically. By the time rivals noticed the web forming around them, they were already ensnared.